Well, amen. Thank you, choir, and Ian, and all of our musicians today. Truly, what would Easter be without this amazing music? Friends, would you please pray with me? Oh God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight. You are our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. So when you all were growing up, did you ever have this experience, roughly this experience? Your parents told you a story, your caregivers told you a story, they read you a book. It was full of all the good things that stories have, an age-appropriate plot, some good, some evil, the right mix of anticipation and unpredictability, and a nice, happy ending where good triumphs over said evil. And it was a lovely story, whatever it was for you. And you went about your life thinking, oh, this was the story, and then you read it for yourself at some point and realized, okay, the actual story is nothing like the one that they told you. The ending was not exactly what your parents read to you. And there are a lot of things that were left out in the middle. Recently, my family and I were at my mother-in-law's house, and she has the original Snow White story. The one written in 1812 by the brothers Grimm, which is indeed grim. My daughter pulled it from the shelf and asked her grandmother to read it, thinking it would be Snow White, a la Disney, and 7 little dwarves dancing and singing. They're reading. I'm doing something else. And in a few minutes, I stop doing what I was doing, and I start listening. And you know why? Because the story was not the cute, sweet little story. It was indeed a very scary story, a very disturbing story. You do not need me to go into it. As my mother-in-law was reading, I saw her face wincing, and I saw my oldest daughter, who can now read, began to read. And then she and her brother looked up at me and said, Mommy, this is not the story we know. This is not the Disney movie. Indeed, it is not. It's a very different story than the one that they knew, and we stopped reading it. On a lighter note, I once knew parents who read the typical Disney princess fairy tales to their 2 young daughters. We all know how those end, and they lived happily ever after. But these parents changed the ending. And instead of they lived happily ever after, they would say, well, and then, insert prince's name here, let's say, and then Belle went to college. And she graduated. And she bought a Eurail pass. And she traveled with her friends in Europe, and she stayed in hostels, meeting all kinds of people and having all sorts of experiences. And then she came back, went to graduate school, and then she entered into whatever profession she had chosen. And after a while, she decided she would get married, and they lived happily ever after. Of course, it did not take their daughters long to realize that that is not exactly how the fairy tales went. We want the ending of the story that we want. We want whatever we consider to be a nice ending. We want it to be all wrapped up in a way that leaves our audience wanting more, to hit play again and again, to reread it again and again. And we want the story that makes us feel good too. We want it to be wrapped up with a bow. Well, friends, we've been in the Gospel of Mark this Lent, and if you've been following along, then you know that Mark's Gospel is blunt and earthy, and it's a little rough around the edges. So our final scene in the Gospel of Mark, our resurrection scene, if you will, follows suit. It is not neat and tidy. It is not all tied up at the end. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary and Salome come to the tomb to anoint Jesus' body, but he's not there. The angel says, go and tell the others that Jesus has been risen from the dead. They go, but they don't tell the others. They run away afraid and never say anything to anyone. And that is the end of the story. The end. Now, the Gospel of Mark was the first gospel written down around 70 CE, and then later on, Matthew and Luke would use Mark's gospel to build their own, to write their own, subtracting things and adding things here and there. And they have very different endings than Mark's gospel, meaning the resurrected Jesus actually shows up in those gospels, and they interact with him. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, but wait a minute, the copy of the Bible I have at my house has a different kind of ending to the Gospel of Mark, kind of similar to the others, where Jesus appears, actually is in the story, and empowers his disciples to go and do things, and they lived happily ever after. But the original ending is not that. What was added, there were two endings added to Mark's Gospel hundreds of years after it was written. They were a triumphalist revision. They were a tie it up with a bow revision. We want it to be tidy. We want new life to just happen. But any new life, any rebirth, any resurrection must be preceded by a death of whatever kind. And then in the wake of that death, there is always a void. There has to be a void for some space for seeds to take root and eventually to grow. But what we want is to leave one place and move to another and feel at home right away. We want to end one relationship and move on to the next and take all the good things and none of the bad. We want to get out of whatever situation that we have outgrown and land in the one that is just the right size for us overnight. We would really like it if we could have a spiritual bypass of just going from the death to the new life without the emptiness. Please and thank you, O God. But friends, we all know it does not work that way, and that even in our quick fix era and our desperate discomfort with uncertainty, we cannot skip over the time that it takes, the space that it takes for resurrection to unfold. But we also know this, that resurrection does unfold, that new life does come again, that even joy comes again. Resurrection evolves and unfolds like the leaves of a wild fern unfolding in the sun. And we know that even though Mark's gospel ends the way that it does, the story indeed had another chapter that wasn't yet known. It had to be lived. It had to be found as life went on. It was never wrapped up neat and tidy. It was, and it still is, more like a story with blank pages following it that come attached with a pen to find and to write the next chapters as we live, to do it in our own living. This particular Easter story ends with a to be continued. It ends with an invitation to discover, to practice how resurrection plays out in our lives and in our community. Clearly, the story didn't end with the women running away and never saying anything, or we would not be here today. And we are here today, having the pen handed to us in our day and our age and our time. And maybe Mark's gospel doesn't actually make such a big deal about resurrection, while the others that were written later do, because it took a while to understand what it all really meant. And really, the bigger miracle wasn't that Jesus was alive again, but rather the bigger miracle was and still is the Christ community that was birthed after the resurrection. That the real power of resurrection lies in the community of Christ followers, and that it always has, and that is the world changer. I mean, yes, Jesus came back. He rose from the dead, but not to stay, only to leave again. Yet he came back with a certain purpose. He had not really been able to say goodbye. Everything happened so quickly. So in coming back and saying goodbye, he was also saying, and yet I will always be with you. I'm here to pass the baton to you. I'm here to tell you once and for all that the power you've been looking for outside of yourself, the way you've wanted me to manifest whatever sort of power you've wanted that to be, you've had it in you the whole time to do so. It's in you now, it always will be. And you here is the second person plural you. It is the y'all. The power y'all have wanted me to display is now yours to do, and what you do together. how you come together to continue to change the world, how you come together to love one another, how you come together in beautiful diversity, and how you work for the liberation of all people, and how you live out mercy and grace and generosity and courage, and in how you write the next chapter, how you find and embody resurrection again and again and again. Friends, maybe your life has a void in it. If it doesn't now, it likely has at some point. But maybe that void feels open and unknown, just like the tomb. And the good news of the resurrection is that the void, the unknown, is also expansiveness. And that's where miracles can actually occur. And expansiveness is first destabilizing. But when we can tolerate it, it becomes the womb of birth, of rebirth. The world is aching right now, we all know that. Much is unsure, much is bleak, both domestically and globally. And frankly, it can seem naive and irrelevant to pay much attention, really give much credence to Easter beyond tradition. If the resurrection of Jesus is true, then what does it have to do with life now? And if the resurrection of Jesus is just a story, what does it have to do with life now? Either way, how does it help us in navigating the pain of the world? There's a gender non-conforming artist named Alok, whose work I quite enjoy. Alok talks about art and story and finding beauty as a way to navigate the world's pain. They talk about making a beauty playlist, especially in times when the world seems especially bleak. All the stories and songs and expressions of art that they happen to find beautiful. And recently in an interview, Alok said, "I can go to my beauty playlist when the world feels hopeless, and I can remember that someone on earth once created this movie that moved me in such a profound way that there's no doubt that we're going to win, because something this spectacularly beautiful could not exist otherwise." By the term "we're going to win," what Alok means is that goodness will win, life will win, the diversity of beauty and dignity will indeed win over all that would keep us scared and competitive and conforming. Whether you believe the resurrection of Christ actually happened in physical form, or whether you believe it is a story with a hopeful message, the many resurrection stories of Jesus are all so uniquely beautiful, each in their own way, that even if it is all created by people, something this beautiful helps us know that goodness will win, that whatever happens in the middle, it all comes back to this, that all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. This kind of goodness, this kind of loving knowing that undergirds all of us is God's love. And the thing about God's love winning is that it means no one loses. Because God's love, this forever goodness, includes everyone. It's all encompassing, inviting us to find the beauty of the moment that we are in, even if what we want to do and what we try to do is to run away terrified. We often cannot grasp the turning points of our lives in the moment, but only in retrospect. For the early Christ community, it was more in the rearview mirror that the alleluias could begin, maybe a bit broken at first, and then building and building with more time and perspective and life to eventually reach an alleluia that is shouted and proclaimed and joyous and sure. Sure enough, at least, to pick up that pen and live into the next chapter together, to write it as we go, to embrace the times of void and emptiness when they come, sheltering through them and finding new life when it emerges, until it builds again to an alleluia that is proclaimed. Friends, beloved of God, whoever you are, if you hear these words, know this: God is not dead, but God is alive even in times like this. And God's love is the strongest force in the universe, and it is also faithfully cheering you on, sometimes in shouts and sometimes in whispers, but with you always, inviting you to pick up the pen, to see the blank pages, and to co-author your resurrection story together. And this community of Christ right here and across the world gathering today is still the miracle of the resurrection. So how can we run into new life even if we are running scared? We know our stories will never be tied up with a bow. We know that we will pass it on unfinished, just as it was passed on to us unfinished. And yet the truth is this, is that God cannot co-author your chapters or our chapters together without you and without us. God can't finish the story with anyone else but us. And God has already put in us everything we need to find and to practice our resurrection now. Amen.